So there's an old adage that goes around the graphic design community and the illustration community of compare and despair. And the idea of it's to discourage comparison. But it can be really confusing for new artists and old artists alike to know where to draw the line between healthy comparison and unhealthy comparison. So stick around, we're going to get into that topic. By the way, if you're tuning into this, I just got a new mic. Honestly, I'm not like super impressed with it. It's a lavalier mic, but it sounds like it's kind of blowing out and peaking. And so it's not necessarily functioning in the way that I wanted it to. I do think it is canceling out the air conditioning sounds, and I might have to play to see if there's usable sound from this. But as of now, I'm not super impressed with it. However, I am making efforts to try to improve this channel, and the one thing I'd ask before we get into the topic is just hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that bell so you get notifications when I'm about to go live. And hey, pick up one of my books, either Jacob's Apartment or Two Stories. It helps me keep going. It helps me stay focused and be interested in providing content for you guys. So here's what I'm thinking. I, as an artist, have struggled with comparisons. What ends up happening when you've been in commercial art for long enough, I guess I should start before that. When you're in like high school, or you're a young artist, especially like I was, growing up in a smaller town, going to my high school, I was the best artist at my high school in my graduating year. And so it made me feel like a very big fish, but it was a very small pond, right? And so it's one of those scenarios where it took me a while. Then I went to junior college and I was one of the best artists at the junior college. And yet again, it's a little bit bigger of a pond, but I was able to feel like a big fish. And I could really like find my value in being the best artist that I knew. And so like that was like a big identity for me, was that, you know, other people were good at sports, other people were good at these other things. But for me, my value for a while rested on being the best artist there was in town. Well, this all gets thrown for a loop when you start finding your identity that way and you go to an art school, because you're no longer the big fish. You're no longer the best there is. And then as you graduate from art school, you get into this professional world where you are literally competing for the same jobs with like half of the heroes, half of the people you really admired are suddenly in the pool of competition for similar jobs as you are, and you start realizing I'm a very small fish in a big ocean. This is a healthy thing to go through that most artists go through. When I used to teach graphic design and illustration at an art school, I'd tell that story about the big fish and the small fish, and I'd relate it to the students saying, hey, everyone here was the best student at their high school. So as we're critiquing, realize it doesn't mean you're a bad artist. Like, most of you could probably impress people with what you do, right? It's what got you here. It's what got you into art school. But now we're trying to level up to where when you're in the market and you're competing against all the people that you admired growing up that got you interested in art, you need to be able to kind of hold up in quality and content to these people. And so it's about like surviving in the ocean, not about surviving in a small pond, because everybody here is doing well in the small pond. So I give them this talk, and I think it was healthy. It's a healthy realization to come to as a young adult. It's like I think part of growing from being like a teenager to, which is very self-focused and very myopic in your viewpoint. Usually as a teenager, at least when I was a teenager, you know, I didn't really think much outside of my immediate circle of friends. Like, I didn't have a big global perspective of things. And as you get older and you get a global perspective, you can start realizing you're less significant than you think you are. However, there's a downside to this, which is there's some really powerful things to be said for feeling like you are significant. One is that you feel like what you're doing is worth doing, right? And so we find our value as artists in both knowing our insignificance, which keeps us struggling and striving to get better and better and better at our craft, but also knowing our significance, which is what we have to say is worth saying, and what we have to make is worth making. And we have the skills, and if we don't have the skills, we can acquire the skills. So it's this weird kind of dueling juxtaposition that is kind of required to do art. Now this gets really hard when it comes to comparison, because part of art, part of making art and leveling up as an artist is really learning from those who came before you. And if you're struggling to like draw a particular thing, say a hand or an eye, you're going to look at the masters that came before you and how they drew hands and how they drew eyes. And you're going to start taking little hints and suggestions from the people who came before you. You're going to be looking at what is an effective way to draw folds on clothes? Who draws those best? Maybe I can glean a little bit from there. You're going to be filling sketchbooks, quite often going to art museums or drawing from life and like really trying to perfect what you're doing. And what you're going to see is like you're going to have like a compass, and your true north is always going to be staying with the drive and the ignorance that you had as a younger artist. The idea that what you have to say is worth saying, and that that you have the skills or can attain the skills in order to accomplish the great thing in art that you want to accomplish. So this again is a weird juxtaposition, but that's the world we live in. So in here, comparison is very valuable in that example, right, of like drawing a hand badly. Comparing your drawing of a hand to a human hand, and then other people's cartooning or their drawings of hands, you can start picking up little cues on how to draw it better and level up as an artist. You can also, again, like make sketches and practices and study, do some anatomical studies, and again, compare and improve. So in this sense, comparison can be really good. I want to bring up another scenario where comparison can be excellent. Another scenario where comparison can be really excellent is if we compare ourselves to people in our field, meaning like the ability to kind of judge your work in the sense of like, if I had to hang my work on a wall next to all of my peers and people in the industry, would my work hold any water? This is an important skill, and it can be very depressing to think about, but it's an important skill to attain, because that starts helping you as an artist, especially a commercial artist, to really figure out if your work has commercial value. And part of how you get your work to a level of professionalism or finish is to compare it to professional and finished work, right? So there again is a kind of healthy use of comparison. I like to call that one the critique wall comparison. When you're in art school, you usually, when you finish an assignment, have to tack your assignment to the wall, and then everybody compares everybody else's assignments that are on the wall. They get critiqued, and there's this kind of inner competition that happens, or inner competitiveness that comes out with most art students, where they don't want, like, there's an element of, I don't want to hang up the worst thing on the wall. And that's a healthy thing. You kind of want to gear your art to be as professional as it can be, as finished as it can be, and as rad as it can look, right? And one best way to know that is to compare. However, comparison is not your best friend as an artist. It can also be your worst enemy. So we've established comparison can be kind of important. There's a million more examples, but I want this video to not take 10 years. Sometimes I can be long-winded, and I think you get the gist. Maybe you can think of other examples of positive comparison in art that could be listed, and you can let me know in the comments section below. Okay. Unhealthy comparison. Unhealthy comparison. Let's start with the second example that I brought up for healthy comparison. That can go awry if you find that maybe your art is the worst on the wall, or maybe you can't see clearly and you're like a lot of artists where you hate your own work and you can't see it objectively, and so you think it's the worst in the wall even though it's not. In those cases, comparison can be crippling. It can be a disabling, horrible experience that actually makes you possibly give up art. I've had many friends who took up art much later in life who had a teacher who unfortunately told them they'd never make it as an artist. And so as a result of that, they took it literally and gave up art for a long period of time, only to rediscover it as an adult and feel robbed of very valuable years of training as an artist and experience drawing in sketchbooks. You can crush somebody as an instructor in art or as a person critiquing art who's not ready for the comparison game, or is maybe early enough in their art journey to where the comparison game really isn't applicable yet because they just need foundations. So that's one way in which comparison can be unhealthy. If you find that that comparison is causing you to not be able to create art. However, you also need to be aware that that can be a crutch, and you don't want to let your fear of comparison be a crutch to you leveling up in art. So it's a thing to finally balance that kind of skates between potentially unhealthy and healthy. And you'll start realizing the difference by asking yourself a question that I find really useful, which is this train of thought going to make me better? Is this train of thought going to help me accomplish my goals as an artist? If it's not, it's probably unhealthy comparison. Okay, now let's get into the really unhealthy comparison. We live in a society that quite often looks at life like it's a lifeboat that we're all vying for resources on. And why wouldn't we think that? You know, our television shows are very much structured around things like, I think there was actually a television show. I know there are some. I don't really watch TV much anymore. But I know there's a couple shows where it's like, hey, pitch us your stuff. You have 5 seconds. It's the elevator pitch. And the idea is like, hey, everything's on the line and you have 5 seconds to make this happen. And if you don't, it's because you didn't craft your pitch well enough. And guess what? Somebody else is on the lifeboat. They're going to have more value and you're gone. What I mean by lifeboat strategy is the idea that we're on this small boat vying for resources and you have to prove your worth. Well, I feel like this can be a really detrimental and bad thing for artists. I think this can be, it can be a really negative thing to approach art with a lifeboat strategy. For one thing, I think that art at its best is kind of against consumerism. Even making art for consumption is kind of antithetical to the idea of consuming because you're making. And consuming usually requires buying or taking or enjoying. Basically, one is a very active activity and the other is a very passive activity where you're taking the work of somebody else and enjoying it, right? I'm not saying it's negative, but I'm just saying it's a little antithetical to the art standpoint of trying to make something or communicate something visually. And so I think that one of the comparisons that you have to be really careful with is not being able to celebrate successes of your peers or of people around you or of artists that you may not like. And that is a hard lesson to learn, because when we're younger, we get into art kind of because we have really good taste. We know what we like and we know what we don't like. And those tastes will grow and be refined, and we'll grow to like things that we might have hated before. We'll grow to hate things that we might have liked before. But regardless, you have this sense of like, this is the kind of art I like. This is good. And a sense of, this is the kind of art I don't like. This is bad. Well, the thing with comparison is you can start comparing your career or your art skills in a really unenviable way to other artists, where you're starting to look at artists who are far better than you and start feeling this thing called envy, right? And it's not envy like, wow, I can't wait to get there, or wow, they work so well, it's very inspiring. No, it's looking at people who are better than you and getting mad or jealous. Or feeling inadequate in your own output because you're nowhere near as good as these people. That can be really crippling and disabling for artists. And again, ask yourself the question, if you're having those kind of thoughts about another artist, is this going to get me further in my art career? Is this going to get me better as an artist? Is this going to help me visually communicate ideas? If it's not, and the answers are usually negative responses, that's a good sign that you're engaging in negative comparison. Another example of negative comparison that I see a lot of young artists fall for is career envy. Career envy is like when you have a friend or a fellow artist who has a really great opportunity. It's okay to be slightly jealous. Like, you should be happy, but I'm sure inevitably, you can say, wow, I'm so jealous, right? That's okay. Overall, you should be happy for your friend. You should be happy for your peer in art. You should be happy that an artist was able to make it and succeed and find a hustle for themselves. That in itself, at its best, can be encouraging because it shows you that it can be done. And if the artist isn't as good as you, in your opinion, hey, that's a good sign that, hey, maybe you've got a shot. Because if they could do it, why can't you? Now, that can become negative if you start going, if they can do it, why can't I? Or if they could do it, why can't I? Like, you know what I mean? It's the approach. Now, if you're looking at other people's work and feeling envy that makes you mad, it makes you hate the art world or hate the publishers that put out the work, or feel hatred or anger, or again, feel like not visually communicating and not continuing with your own work, or maybe not leveling up in your skills, then I'd say that's a sign of unhealthy comparison. So yes, I guess to wrap up, this wasn't the most thorough thing, but to wrap up, compare and despair, totally a good phrase. You as an artist should not be focused on everyone else's journey. You need to focus on your own. However, sometimes you're going to have to compare. It helps to backplan other artists' careers, especially when you're starting. It's hard when you're starting in commercial art to know where to start, where to even begin, and looking at a successful artist that you admire and looking, where did they start, right, isn't a bad practice. But trying to recreate their steps exactly could be a practice in futility because the industry is constantly changing. However, back planning it and looking at where they started and where they ended up and what steps they followed to get there can give you a path. It can give you a suggestion of some things you could do that you aren't doing, or things that you could do better that you're currently doing but not doing as well as you could. Does that make sense? So my point is, some comparison is good and essential for a career in art, and especially for a young artist trying to get better, and for older artists trying to kind of stay relevant in their field. However, comparing to the point of it leading to despair is a really dangerous thing. Now, I'm midway through a giant graphic novel that we're doing for Turner Publishing called Not Death But Love, and I have to tell you, every once in a while, I'll be like getting closer and closer to the halfway point of this giant book project. And I'll look at artists around me that are way faster, right? That are way more prolific, they put out more work, maybe have different life circumstances so they don't have to worry about money as much as I do. And it can be really tempting to feel jealousy or envy of those artists. Anytime I even have the bud of that thought in my head, I have to catch myself and remind myself that is the kind of compare and despair that doesn't help. It's not going to make me more productive, right? And it's not going to get me closer to my end goal. What will get me closer to my end goal is working on my own journey, working on improving myself, and working on getting my goals done so that I hopefully can be a good example to other artists who are also on their own journeys trying to get better. It's an interesting contrast, but I do want to chime in because I think quite often people will go one direction, which is completely wrong, or the complete opposite, which I think is a completely wrong approach too. You can't do art without comparing. You can't do good art without comparing, in my opinion. You really do need to look at those who came before you and those who currently exist at the time you do to get a good example of where you're going wrong and where you could go right, especially when it comes to art and technique. But you also can't get so stuck in comparison that you allow it to demoralize your own journey or allow it to make you give up or use it as a crutch. Like, I think a lot of people, when they're young, draw. And I think one of the big differences between artists that continue to draw and artists who just kind of go, this is really hard because they're trying to move from that stage of drawing stick figures to being representational. The people who stick with it have one thing in common. They didn't despair. They fueled themselves to continue. And when it got hard, they looked, they compared, but in the positive, good version of comparison, they leveled up and they continued their own journey and their own fight. So yeah, if you're out there, I hope this was helpful. Let me know. And what are your thoughts on comparison? Do you compare your work with other artists? Do you find it useful to do that? Do you think that it's bad to compare in any way your art to other artists? I tend to think, after having talked about this and explained a little bit of my thinking, that you need a little bit of both. You need healthy comparison. Healthy comparison is good. You just need to really try to avoid the negative comparison, where you're going to basically derail yourself on your own path. The other thing I'll say as a last word on this, I've met artists who compare and despair still at my age or even older, and compare and despair to an extreme extent. And I will tell you, if you feed the compare and despair thing, if you can feed negative comparison, it breeds more negativity, and it starts affecting people's physical health and their own happiness. I think it's because if you live and you allow yourself to feel envy, you start being a bitter person. You start being really unhappy. It starts affecting your health. It starts affecting your ability to enjoy when your friends succeed. If your friends do succeed, they may not want you around, or you might not be able to help them out as they're going through the struggles of success. Because weirdly enough, sometimes success brings with it more responsibility and more headaches than failure. But friends that, are happy for their other friends' successes, that breeds a friend you want to be around. That's a friend you want to call up when good things happen because you know they're cheering for you. And you want to call when bad things happen because you know they're rooting for you. That's the kind of friend and artist we should all aspire to be. So yeah, let me know what you think in the comments section below. Hopefully this audio came out okay. It might be really overblown and ridiculous. Yeah, that's my thoughts. I'll see you on the next vlogins.